So, hello everybody. Welcome to everyone that's tuning in for the rest of the sustainability stream at the CIPS virtual conference. Delighted to have you. We still have people from all over the world willing to join us for this session, and we have another cracker. We do have another fantastic selection of people joining us. Unfortunately, it looks like we've not been able to get Eric from Danone to be able to join us, which is a shame. So that gives more time and more ability for the rest of this wonderful three to be able to share their knowledge with us. And we have a fantastic spread of diversity of opinion here as well. So I'm Oliver Hurry, and I'm delighted to be helping to chair the sustainability stream of the CIPS conference. And I work with procurement and sustainability professionals all over the world, ultimately work together and solve big problems. So delighted to be part of this. I'm joined today to talk about creating social value and understand exactly what that means for those that don't know what that means, and really how procurement can play a role in creating value for supply chains, for their businesses, and for society as well. I'm joined by Claire Costello of the Co-op, who I know firsthand are doing some fantastic work on engaging with the supply chain on sustainability. We're joined by Barry Hooper of the Ministry of Justice, a major UK government department for those outside of the UK that obviously deals with criminal, civil and family justice and all of the stuff that involves. And also Paul Politito from GiveWith, who are, I keep hearing about everywhere, fascinating proposition and are doing some fantastic things to channel funds from where they are to where they should be, and measuring the impact. And measurement of impact in social value is a big challenge that I'm sure we'll get on to. So thanks, panel, and I'm sure we'll have a lively discussion. So we've got a few things to cover, but should we tackle with what is social value? What does it mean to you, and why is it important? And perhaps, Barry, we could start with you.
Yeah, thanks, Oliver. So I think social value is quite an interesting concept, which I think has evolved over time. If I look back to the early days of sort of early 90s and corporate social responsibility, I think the agenda has fundamentally shifted from where it was in those days in terms of just being about EMAS 57, BS 5750 and ISO standards. I think where we are now is in a position where actually the CSR agenda and social value agenda is much broader. So for me specifically within the MOJ, it is about social enterprise, it's SMEs, it's about diversity of the supply chain. But there are also some specific nuances for us within the Ministry of Justice, because clearly our role is about rehabilitation of offenders. And ultimately, when people go through the justice system and come out the other end, these are individuals that could be living next door to you at some point. So our job is really about rehabilitation. So a big push for us on social value is actually the employment of ex-offenders, because we know that one of the biggest issues that we face on stopping reoffending is actually being able to provide accommodation and work. So there's a real big push for us in terms of including that within our agenda. And suffice to say that we've had a lot of support and traction from our wider supply base in terms of supporting us in that endeavour. But equally, it's much further than that. So if we look at our current construction and new build programme, we're in the process of building 2 new prisons, HMP 5 Wales and HMP Glenparva. Both of those through the work that we've been doing with the Land Lease and Kia, our providers in that space. And we've actually made some big commitments in terms of commitments on SME expenditure, on apprenticeships, on actually looking at employment of ex-offenders. And within government, I think it's fair to say that we are taking our responsibilities quite seriously in that regard, by making sure that through the work that Sam Rowbury in the government policy team has been doing to ensure that social value is embedded in not only the way that we work, but also government policy and its application in our spending profile.
Yeah, absolutely. So social value is, if you're a business, we'd all be cliche saying it's in your DNA. And, social value is what the Ministry of Justice ultimately does. So even more reason for procurement to play a role in that. And Claire, your thoughts. What does social value mean to you at the Co-op, and what are you doing about it?
I think it's really interesting. It's probably similar to some of the things that Barry was saying around that step on and the growth from CSR. I think really core to the DNA, in your words, of the Co-op is how we look after our community, our members, and the environment around us. And so for us, it means taking those social, environmental and economic impacts and making sustainable change. So that it is that significant step on from core social, corporate social responsibility. And for us, it's around creating value for our members, for our communities. and for our wider society. Again, I think it's fair to say we've been on a journey. It's much more than just kind of donating money to the local charities. It is really about making significant change. So things like working with our supply base to say, how do we build in incremental apprenticeships? We're quite fortunate in that the co-op, also has a number of academies that we run. So how do we work with our supply bases to support those academies? In the beginning of COVID, some of our suppliers were very good and very forthright in terms of providing equipment to the academies to help children with very difficult economic backgrounds to actually be able to manage homeschooling. And I think to Barry's point, things like, reoffenders, understanding how we can support getting people back into work. So I think that idea of it's more than corporate social responsibility. It's not just about donating money and philanthropy. It's about sustainable change that really helps to improve the life, the economic, the environment, well-being. And for us, it's, communities, members, and again, that wider society around us.
Absolutely. And for those perhaps outside the UK, the co-op, of course, is a retailer in the UK built upon a kind of principle of community and cooperation, of course, hence the name. Excellent.
Indeed. Along with our funeral care, don't forget those guys as well, and insurance, healthcare, just put that advert out there.
Indeed. There's so many arms to the co-op, I lose track. But yeah, you are absolutely everywhere and adding social value everywhere, which is good. So Paul, over from the West Coast in California, and still probably very much in the dark over there. And let's share your thoughts on what social value means to you.
Well, social value to us is about leveraging the transaction itself to create more social value for suppliers, buyers, and improving the lives of people in need, and also helping the planet. So I think, traditionally, sustainability has been looked at as raw material sourcing, manufacturing, packaging, shipping, end-of-life recycling. And I'm like, wait a minute, you forgot a very, very important activity, and that is the transaction, that something's being bought and sold. And so, Oliver, what we've been focused on is how do you take that transaction, the power of that transaction, to create more value for social value for suppliers, buyers, and society. And I think this is a really, really exciting time where we can leverage the purchasing power of corporations, sourcing and procurement, as a way to negotiate best pricing and best terms. Let's get that out there, that the remit or the mandate of sourcing and procurement is to negotiate best pricing and best terms. But what other social value can sourcing and procurement departments earn for their corporations that allow them to take care of other business objectives at the expense of their suppliers? And why would their suppliers be willing to underwrite these social impacts, the social value, on behalf of sourcing and procurement departments over and above best pricing and best terms? Because the process of selling is enormously expensive and enormously inefficient. The Fortune 500 spends about 25% of its gross revenues just trying to attract and retain the next dollar of revenue. So there's this enormous pool of funding that can be squeezed for additional business value for the seller, the buyer, and society. And so what we've done for sourcing and procurement departments and for nonprofits and for social enterprises is to say, we found a big pool of funding that can create additional business value for the sourcing and procurement departments and a new funding stream for nonprofits and social enterprises by applying a better return on investment for these very expensive and inefficient sales efforts on the part of sales departments. So we think that social impacts as a sales incentive will someday be as ubiquitous as free shipping, that social impacts will be just part of the transaction. And I'll explain more about how that works later. But I think that the power of transactions have the power to transform.
Yeah, absolutely. In the session at the start of the conference, we were talking with the panel of CPOs and those in sustainability about the importance of being able to show procurement's role in sustainability. How can it be made more easy for procurement to understand how to embed sustainability and social value in what they do, and how do you measure the impact is a massive challenge. And of course, everyone in sustainability and social impact knows that getting money can be particularly difficult. So it's really interesting to see how you're finding ways to fund those projects, but also measure the impact. In terms of how you can actually take action as a procurement professional, because obviously this is the Chartered Purchasing Supply event. Everyone is attending as a professional, a procurement professional. So Barry, in your experience, what would be your advice about how a fellow procurement professional can actually get started on making a social impact in the way that they work? What can they do?
Yeah, I think the starting point really is about understanding the architecture of your organisation, and that probably starts with what is the scope of the commercial or the procurement function. In my view, it's fairly simple in that I take the view that, as the CPO for the MOJ, it's my responsibility to be the custodian for all of those policies that we operate internally and their application in the external environment. So in that sense, I think the starting point really is understanding, what are the corporate objectives and what are the policies and things that you currently track internally that you need to track externally. So things like carbon reduction clearly is something that translates very clearly internally to an external environment. Whether it's about the policies that you have internally on diversification of the workforce, gender pay balance, gender pay gap, those issues, to what extent do those correlate externally? And I think when you look at it through that lens, what you find is that there's a real concentration risk that exists in a commercial function through the commercial line. And there is a real question, I think, there to be asked internally around, well, do you have the right level of governance around that? And are you engaged in the right level of conversation? So, for example, the articulation of that third-party risk, is that clearly defined in your audit and risk committee? Is that being tracked appropriately? Because it can be very difficult to try and create that narrative internally within the organisation without that level of understanding. So I think the starting point is crystallising the understanding and the scope, and then using that as a platform to then drive the agenda. And the rate and pace at which you drive that agenda will be based on probably appetite of your staff, to Claire's point, appetite of the customer base, appetite of the investors. And there's something about how you sort of use that to frame the narrative. And I think that for me is the starting point. We within the MOJ have taken quite a few of the sort of the principles that have been adopted in the financial services sector around CSR reporting and social value. And we're embedding that within the 3 lines of defence model. But again, that will vary based on the level of maturity of your organisation, where you're coming from and the operational structures. But I think understanding the policies, the landscape and the environment within which you operate is the first step. And then I think once you understand that, you can then work out a plan to then take that forward. I mean, clearly I'm in the enviable position of actually having a central government commercial policy function that are doing some of that thinking and the alignment to government policy for us in the background. And to bring that to life as an example, we've obviously issued the outsourcing playbook, which has been quite transformative in the way that we're engaging the market in terms of looking at outsourcing and what that means. The construction playbook, which follows on from that, is, for me, quite a transformational piece of work in that we are working closely with Nick Smallwood from the IPA, the Infrastructure Projects Authority, colleagues in the Cabinet Office and policy, to actually take the practical principles of the social value piece and actually embed that within live current projects. So we're not just talking about it, we're actually delivering real tangible benefits in live environment situations, engaging with the supply chain and taking them on that journey. And I think, again, sort of thinking about, if you are to do this, what are the tactical or strategic projects you might want to consider to create that platform from which you can celebrate success? And I think that for me would be the starting point.
Yeah. Very good advice. Very good advice. Great to have you join us, Eric, and I'm glad you'll be involved. I'll come to you in a second. But Claire, what would be your sort of practical advice for someone in procurement who kind of knows and feels they should be doing more on social value? Where do they start? What do they do?
I think you need everything that Barry said around policy is absolutely right. I think you also need top-down support, and you need to educate bottom-up from the buyer population, so that you're communicating consistently across the organisation. I mean, I'm very fortunate in that, the whole vision for the co-op is cooperating for a fairer world. So it starts from the very top for us, all the way from our board through to our exec, that it's important to them, which then makes it a lot easier for you to open that conversation. But to Barry's point, to make it practical, you really need your buying population, your stakeholder, your business partners to feel that same passion. And so I think having something that you can pin it to, that explains, why this is worthwhile. Paul talked about, the whole transaction having a value to it. I think is really important. Again, I'm fortunate in that I'm in an organisation where this is something that's seen to be incredibly important to us. But if I put, another organisation in mind where I've come from prior to here, it's the type of thing where we talk about supporting our communities. People get excited by that. So for me, the hook is finding something that works for your organisation, that sits alongside their strategy, that works for the buyers to be able to talk to their business stakeholders in a language that those business stakeholders will understand and get excited by, because this has got to be the win-win that Paul was talking to earlier on. There's something in it for the supplier, there's something in it for the community, and there's something in it for your business. So the hook is getting people excited, but in a way that it's meaningful, and you can land it in the business in language that makes sense to those individuals. So if I was somebody starting off in this world, I would talk to my leadership and get that top-down support. I would be talking to my buyers to make sure they understand the what, and more importantly, the why, so that they get that endorsement and they understand what it is you're trying to do, but why you're trying to do it, so they can get passionate and excited about it. And then practically think about how you're going to deliver it. So whether you start to think about language in your tenders and your RFPs, is it how you're going to analyze it when they come back in? Do you need to take a soft approach and just think about it through your supplier relationship management activity? All of it can be done at one time, or it can be done in steps. But ultimately, this is a big elephant, and you're not going to crack it in one go. You need to actually think about what you can practically do. But for me, the start point is get the engagement, get the excitement, and then you'll get a little bit of momentum.
Absolutely. And again, I would echo what you said in terms of the panel we had at the start of the day, which was about, if you need to win hearts or minds, or use numbers, or look at risk, or look at cost, or even massage a few egos if you need to in order to get what you need to done, it all has the benefits. You need to think about that audience and how you're going to inspire them. So hi, Eric, perfect timing, because I can come to you now straight away. So what does social value mean to you, and what's some of the practical steps that you would recommend from your experiences at Danone?
Thank you very much for your invitation. So, I think social value for Danone is something that has been pretty much there for some time. One of our CEO and one of, let's say, the founder and visionary of Danone was Antoine Riboud, and as early as 1972, he stated in a speech that became famous in France about, I would say, the fact that our business model should always find the cursor between the economic factor and the social factor, and stating very clearly that we have a dual project as a company between social and economics, and that our responsibility as a company doesn't stop at the end of our factory doors. And I think that's something that for us has evolved in a way over time. Of course, that is really part of the culture of the company, to a point where this year we decided to change our article of association to become the first listed company in France as a mission enterprise, société à mission, alongside to our commitments to become a B Corp certified company fully by 2025. So I think this is more than that. I think what for me social is really, and I am happy to be also the CEO of the Danone Ecosystem Fund, is that I think we have kind of an historical choice to make now as corporate. Is, do we want to use the strengths of our business as a force for good, or do we want to play karate with the system and try to break it, or do you want to use the strengths and play the judo and use the strengths of the system to transform it? And I think fundamentally, this is what an entreprise à mission, a benefit corporation could be and should be, is ready to put the intelligence, the collective intelligence, in terms of innovation, in terms of productivity, in terms of innovation, at the service of something. And I think that's really the tension in which we are, because we are far from being perfect. We are in a transition journey. So that's one thing that for me is important. The second element that I believe is also quite important is, in a way, and I know I'm talking today with a lot of very procurement excellence people around this virtual room, is creating inclusive supply chain. Yeah, I think it's also a choice. I think corporation can have the possibility to create supply chains that are polished for them, perfect. But then the question is, by doing that, do you really shape the world you want to live in? Or is your supply chain a tool to impact positively and transform the world? And I think and make it more inclusive. I can take a very simple example. I think, when you look at the palm oil topic globally, of course, we know this is a major concern in terms of deforestation. So you could say, let's stop buying palm oil. This is not what we say, because palm oil is also at the same time the only agriculture commodities that help people to get out of poverty. And I can see that personally when I go to Indonesia or Malaysia and I'm visiting some field. What is important, however, is to make sure that pre-competitively we work in a system that stops deforestation and that creates a segregation, a traceability to make sure that this commodity is able to be sourced in a sustainable manner. And this is where I think the intelligence of a procurement expertise is super valuable as a force for good. To go back to my example. So for me, that's what social value is, and we know that an increasing number of customers now and consumers, of course, that at the end of the day are just people, are arbitrating their choice also based on this. And if we're not anticipating that, if we're not offering answers to that, I think people will just stop buying our brands. So we need to propose this position. So that's what social value is for me. Yep. Using the force of business, thinking really about how you create inclusive supply chains when you are in corporate, and you have a duty of transparency on what you do, because we are not perfect as Danone. We are in a transition to our goal, and we need to report the progress we're making, but also where we are imperfect.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm conscious we've got 7 minutes left. We do want to have some questions from the audience, and it's not just comments about how wonderful Barry's backdrop is in there. There are some good questions. But Paul, just very briefly, you're an example of a practical action that procurement can take. Tell us a little bit more about how that works. And
I think to build on what Barry and Claire and Eric are talking about is, how do you make this process inclusive, and how do you make it work for all stakeholders? And that's where, as you talked about, Oliver, the math comes in, right? The measurement. And so we've really been interested in how to leverage a transaction, the transfer of goods and services for value, as an agent for positive social change and creating additional social value. Let me give you an example. In this case, the buy side, the procurement sourcing procurement department, is Boston Consulting Group. They're out to buy cloud licenses. In this case, IBM is the seller. They're offering IBM hybrid cloud. And they say to Boston Consulting Group, if you buy IBM hybrid cloud, one of the other things we'll add is social impact as part of the transaction. The way our platform works, both companies type their name into our platform. We've done a deep dive on more than 9,000 companies. Every company that has an ESG rating, an environmental social governance rating in MSCI, we know everything those companies are doing in the area of CSR, sustainability, philanthropy, every nonprofit they're working with, every initiative and award they've won. Then we pull their ESG ratings from MSCI, True Value Labs, and CSR Hub to understand their ESG rating from a couple different angles. Then we pull the standards they're using from GRI, Global Reporting Initiative, SASB around sustainable accounting, to deem whether the projects that we're going to surface as part of this transaction are financially material to the supplier and the buyer, essentially a materiality assessment. Then we pull some custom Nielsen data that tells us, what do your customers care about? And what do your employees care about? We take all that information. We have a network, a global network of nonprofits and social enterprises that are carrying out social impacts all over the world. What we find out about Boston Consulting Group is that they've recently, in fact, they were the first global consulting firm to go net zero on carbon. So it starts to surface projects within our platform around climate and carbon. The top algorithmic match was a social enterprise called Indigo Ag that through regenerative farming stores carbon, and there's carbon certificates. So Boston Consulting Group negotiates best pricing and best terms on these cloud licenses. But in addition to that, IBM underwrites carbon storage certificates through Indigo Ag as part of the transaction, transfers them to Boston Consulting Group. So Boston Consulting Group and their sourcing and procurement department gets to go and say, look, we negotiated best pricing, best terms, but now we have these carbon storage certificates that we can apply to our net zero pledge. See, the Boston Consulting Group would have written a check out of precious profits, okay? But in this case, they got those carbon certificates as part of the negotiation at the expense of the supplier, right? So they got best pricing, best terms, plus they were able to accomplish some other business objectives at the expense of the supplier. So why did that work for IBM? So I talked earlier that 25% of the SG&A sales and general expense, 25% of gross revenues are spent attracting your next dollar of revenue or retaining revenues. So we go to underperforming client acquisition expenses on the part of the supplier and squeeze that for additional sales success for IBM. So now IBM is accomplishing other business objectives with those underperforming client acquisition dollars, and they're able to transfer them to the buyer and society. So we're now sort of cutting sourcing and procurement departments into these underperforming client acquisition dollars in the way of social value that they would never have had access for. So, or access to before. So the power of transactions themselves. So what was being transferred, cloud licenses, weren't necessarily sustainable in your traditional thinking, but we turned that transaction into storing carbon. We turned a transaction into something that of course helps us against what I think is our most serious threat as a planet, climate change. And so we were able to create additional business value for IBM, additional business value for Boston Consulting Group, and store carbon. So we turned transaction into something sustainable. And that's social value.
Interesting. So you're almost helping sales to embed sustainability in their way of working as well as procurement. It's that's really
exactly, so, Oliver. Social impacts are a sales incentive, like any other sales incentive. Yeah,
it's everyone's responsibility, and so it should be the way. Okay, so we've got a couple of questions, and I want to put them to the audience, and we're allowed to run over a little bit. They've been very nice to us. I don't know quite how long I'll last for. So one couple of questions that have come up that I want to kind of rattle around is, what do you do when your boss doesn't care about this? What do you work for a business that isn't necessarily got social value on the agenda, or even worse, a business that pretends to have social value on their agenda? And linked to that, obviously, is when you're in the middle of a pandemic, how do you actually going to keep this at the top of the agenda? So let's wrap that together in is, how do you do it in a business that is distracted or doesn't care? Quick round the table, Barry, your thoughts.
I think start locally. I mean, I put some comments there in the chat. I think part of it is also about just looking at what is the driver in your organization. Sometimes it doesn't have to be top down, it can be bottom up. And if I certainly look at sort of my children, you know, they are certainly more environmentally aware than any of the generation that's gone before them. And actually that in itself also creates an opportunity to drive change and create an agenda.
Absolutely. Claire?
Stole my answer. I was similar. Find the individuals who are passionate about it and let them loose a little bit. You know, we've got individuals in our team who will work with suppliers to do amazing things, which, you know, yes, for me, I'm fortunate that it's underpinned by what we want to do as an organisation, but I would encourage it anyway. So if you've got individuals who have got a passion and can work with a supplier who is interested in foraging in this area as well, then let them go and let them have a play. I think the other piece is, you know, during the time of COVID, actually, I don't think there's been less interaction with suppliers. I think there's been more, this sense of in it together, the sense of trying to deliver for communities having incredibly difficult times, and the sense of trying to deliver for individuals in very, very disparate and, you know, challenging environments. For me, I think the supply base has massively stepped up and really wants to support that. So actually, I think now is the time where suppliers are more willing to do it than perhaps they were before.
Absolutely. Eric, your thoughts? What would be your advice? Although Danone very much does get this.
Well, I think one of the things that is very important is to make sure that you go back to what your business stands for, because at the end of the day, we are a corporate, we are a business, right? So, and then you need to really to ask yourself what you can impact because you are a business, and the intersection between the impact you want to have and the relevancy with your business can become a purpose for you to convince people internally. And I think very often when it's very difficult to convince is when you try to convince people on things that are not really related to where they're good at. It's as simple as that. But I think you need to do a bit of sociodynamic to build on what Claire just said. I think we have a tendency to try to convince people that we will never convince, rather than trying to leverage the people that can be very strong ally. So I think it's the same dynamic, and that's something that very often with my teams we're trying to address, this intersection between what's relevant and where I can truly have as an impact. So and we know that procurement teams are extremely focused on delivery, and if you're really able to maximize that, they can really do wonder.
Absolutely. Paul, your thoughts. How do you inspire someone who needs to inspire others on this?
The one thing that's universally true is it's about business value, right? Make the business case, root it in math. What I just made with IBM and BCG was a business case. When the math is undeniable, then the reasons for doing this are inevitable, right? So I think that what you have to demonstrate to companies is that social impact as a tool at the point of transaction is more efficient and more profitable. So we go to CEOs and say, we have a technology platform that's designed to increase your sales, improve your profits, and positively influence your share price. We make a business case for this. Of course, we all think it's the right thing to do, and there's urgency around these issues. But what we're doing is we're making the business case that social value at the point of transaction is simply more profitable for suppliers, buyers, and society. It's a business case. And I think that's something that appeals to all stakeholders. Stakeholder capitalism means addressing the needs of all stakeholders. And I think when you make the business case, you're able to do that. And there's a business case for social value at the point of transaction.
Absolutely. Absolutely. How are we doing on time? I'd make it over, but I wasn't sure. How are we doing on time? Got plenty of time? Okay, well, we'll carry on then. In terms of the challenge around, I suppose, kind of measuring social value, I know this is a massive issue we could probably need about an hour on, but we've got 1 minute more now, we're told. I've dropped that bombshell of a question. We've got 1 minute. Okay, let's have 1 minute on it. Barry, how do you measure social value?
I think it's a real challenge at the moment, whether it's, it depends. There's a whole host of measures out there, whether it's carbon reduction targets, whether it's apprenticeship schemes. What I would suggest is that you just start off small. I mean, clearly, the example that I gave around offender employment is something that we're looking to set internal targets and achieve against. And I think there's something about taking a slight piecemeal approach to some of this rather than trying to boil the ocean in one go. And it's just working out which of metrics you want to publicly put out there, whether you formally publish them and publish your performance against it, or whether you just serve that internally. There is something about making sure you've got the right level of visibility around what is actually being delivered and then celebrating that success.
Yeah, find an organisational target that already exists and attach to it. Claire, your thoughts, measurement of impact?
I'd agree that I think there's different maturities across different parts of that umbrella, using the term that was used in chat earlier on. Sustainability is slightly more mature. It's easier to measure a lot of that. Carbon has got many more agreed targets that you can use, refridge and all of those good areas. As you start moving out into more social areas, it's a little bit more difficult to actually put a value to it consistently. I do think those measures are coming. So I'd agree actually with what Barry just said. Sorry to be boring on that one, but I do think it's capturing what you can and then agreeing that measure going forward. My preference is always to try and use a standard as opposed to recreating something within the industry, because then it's something that everybody can understand. So I think there's a little bit of, as we mature in this area as a profession, I think we'll get some standardization that we can all work to. I think on this one, we do look to the public sector a little bit because they are ahead of most of the private sector. So, you know, we're fast begging, stealing and borrowing the measures that they're using.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, we are very much out of time. It's got very dark here, and Paul, looks like it's getting light where you are. So we've obviously had a good chat. And thank you all, panel, for such a great conversation. We've got a fantastic number of people looking into us. So clearly social value is important, and hopefully we've made a difference. So thank you all, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.